I'm John Batchelor. Good evening. This is the John Batchelor Show. Gordon Chang, my colleague and co-host, Forbes.com. He's traveling. He's on the line with me. And we're very pleased to go to Stephen Yates, the chairman of the Idaho Republican Party. Before that, he was CEO of DC International Advisory, and he served with the Bush administration in the vice president's office. Very familiar with Asia and the promise of China, but right now we have to deal with the threat of China. Stephen, a very good evening to you. Gordon and I discussing this are taken with a news item from Reuters, just put up. This is breaking news. The Secretary of State John Kerry in Hawaii making a speech about the Asia Pacific, calling attention to the fact that the United States regards itself as an Asian Pacific nation. Good for us. However, here is the meat of the Secretary of State's remarks aimed at Beijing. The United States takes no position on questions of sovereignty in the South and East China Seas, but we do care about how those questions are resolved. We firmly oppose the use of intimidation, coercion, or force to assert a territorial or maritime claim by anyone, and we firmly oppose any suggestion that freedom of navigation and overflight and other lawful uses of the sea and airspace are privileges granted by big states to small ones. The Obama administration talking big. Stephen, I want to turn the screw here. I don't want to talk about what the Obama administration has missed about the Chinese aggression. I want you, as chairman of the Republican Party, as a man familiar with the Republican Party policy, foreign and domestic, to aim to the future. What does a GOP foreign policy look like that would make it very clear to Beijing that its aggression will stop?
Well, John, I think it's a very important problem that we face. First, I think that a serious Republican foreign policy would begin with building trust in allies. And I don't like the formulation of saying that we don't take a position on these territorial claims when we have a non-ally contesting the sovereignty of an ally. I think we should be clear about our support for our allies, and I think Republicans should be unified behind that. I think our Republican foreign policy would need to stand on real capability to deter, dissuade, and the challengers in this region, but also to reassure our allies. We'd have to have a Navy that is fully funded, trained, and deployed, not one that is in retreat in some respects, declining in budgets, but also declining in deployed capabilities. It really matters much more what we are capable of doing and what we demonstrate that we have in standing by our allies, and it matters what we say in these speeches.
Gordon?
Steve, with the Secretary Kerry's words, how are they going to be received in Beijing?
Well, I think that they're received in Beijing largely in the way many statements by this administration are. They hear them, they will protest the things they don't like, but in many ways they know that this too shall pass. There have been many, many speeches given, but the general trend of development on the ground and at sea in the Asia Pacific is a time of opportunity for Beijing. They're not seeing real pushback, real risk, real prices to be paid for what they're doing.
The puzzle, I want to stay with this, imagining a Republican future. There are voices in the Republican Party, the junior senator from Kentucky comes to mind, who turn to the future and say, not our business. And once upon a time that was called isolationism. These days it has fancier words, but not our business. Is that a credible position for the Republican Party in Asia, Stephen?
I don't think it's a credible position as defined. I really believe that a realistic approach to foreign policy, defense, national security is that we need to be in a position to help others help themselves. Part of that is that the oceans are so vast, and really the United States is uniquely capable of helping balance interests in the Pacific and around the world. And we don't have to be interjecting ourselves into conflict. But if we're out there making sure that the high seas have freedom of navigation, we're making sure that we're training and equipping allies to take care of their own affairs, then it's a much more stable world, and America can be free to focus and invest at home.
Gordon?
Steve, when you look at the Republican positions, there seem to be many of them, and yet when a platform is eventually agreed upon, normally what happens is that a party normally comes to sort of like the mainstream of American foreign policy. Despite what Rand Paul might want at any particular moment, is that what the Republican Party is going to do, return to mainstream foreign policy principles?
Well, I think Rand Paul would probably contest the proposition that his isn't a mainstream foreign policy. And his foreign policy is something that's probably, I think, fairly characterized as a work in progress. But I do think that the Republican Party platform nationally tends to come back to where a majority of the delegates at a convention are. And I should say, while I support the idea of having a good, strong, and clear platform, I did work in a White House for 5 years where there wasn't a single meeting at which someone began or ended with, what was the platform of the party at the last convention with regard to this issue? So I think it's important to have broad strokes of where a president's leadership wants to go and where a party wants to go. But really, when it comes to what we'll do at a time of crisis, it's really not these speeches and candidates that are going to determine.
Early in the Bush administration, there was a provocation by China, and the Bush administration answered it toughly. This is before 9/11, and it was lost. The Chinese, I take it, have long memories. Would that work today, Steve, in this environment? The Chinese provoke, and the United States answers with rough stuff.
It could work. Usually we go through a cycle of administrations. The Chinese have a long and consistent approach to what they do. That's the virtue of the political system that they have. Early in presidencies, the Chinese are a little bit concerned about not knowing where a president will go, not knowing quite the limits of what he's willing to do in using American power, material, or other influence. But by the time you're in a sixth year of an administration, they feel like they've taken a good measure, and it's a little bit harder to try to negotiate with them successfully. But in general, when times get tough, if we demonstrate an ability to push back, it helps us actually achieve peaceful outcomes in later times.
Gordon?
Steve, the Chinese really didn't test the Obama administration during their first months, though of course they did with the Bush administration. Is it possible that the Chinese are going to test the Obama administration in its last months, just as it's going out, thinking that it can maybe get away with something that it otherwise couldn't?
Well, every administration is concerned about that, and it has to be a logical possibility to deal with. My frank assessment is that the Chinese don't feel like they've needed to test this president. They feel like they've had a permissive environment most of the time. And if they're smart, at least in sensing, if things are going their way, keep pushing ahead, but don't push too ahead to ruin a good thing.
I want to go to this idea. The Chinese are responding tonight by saying Secretary Kerry's call for a freeze. They're rejecting it, a call for a freeze. Covert action, Stephen. Once upon a time, that was part of the American toolkit. Would that work these days in China? They seem very brittle in Beijing right now with all of these pledges of loyalty to Xi Jinping by the military. That's not a sign of strength. How about covert action, say in Xinjiang, or covert action in the South China Sea?
Well, the moment we start talking about covert action, it's no longer covert in a certain way, but I am a big believer that we need to be using all of our tools of influence, and that particular tool has atrophied. It's been a victim of politics and demagoguery in my humble estimation. And we need to have much more skilled practitioners, well-funded and trained and deployed to do these kinds of things. We need to work more closely with our allies in being able to influence things inside China. They do a great deal in our country to influence what our leaders deal with in our communities and in our policymaking processes. People are sensitive to it, but they're not aware of the extent of it. We should be doing everything we can to influence things there to our advantage as well.
I want to press the point, Steve. We've got a lot of friends out in Asia. They'd welcome working with us, wouldn't they?
They would indeed, and they have capabilities where leadership would be all the signal they need to know that we're back in this business and we're serious. It's somewhat like we've dealt with in the Middle East, where most of the leaders will say, if you're for half measures, we want nothing to do with this. But if you're dead serious, we're right there ready to take the risk with you.
Gordon, we need a leadership that's going to declare that it understands China is hostile. We don't have one right now. We need an election, Gordon.
We certainly do, and I hope that the Republican Party can supply some better answers than what we've had.
Now it's time for my proverb. I've been holding back. An army of sheep led by a lion will defeat an army of lions led by a sheep. Stephen Yates of the Idaho Republican Party, Gordon Chang of Forbes.com.